السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على حبيبنا محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. First of all, would like to welcome you all for this second session in which we will be discussing the Zionism and the Gaza crisis. But first, we will give an introduction into Zionism, inshallah, azza wa jal. And from there, we will move on. But we will try to recap until others join in what we covered yesterday, inshallah, azza wa jal. And from there, we start our discussion by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yesterday, we had discussed this, the current crisis. In particular, we touched on it briefly. But what is happening today in Gaza, our humanity versus our iman. Here, we are failing Gaza. We are failing miserably, both as humanity and both as an ummah. And this is something that is very difficult to deal with, this level of impotence that this ummah unfortunately has. What we will be going forth with is some historical examples briefly to see how Islam was different from everyone else in the history of the region, and then seeing the stark example with the Crusades and the current Zionist occupation. But remember yesterday we discussed briefly the Byzantine-Persian Wars. I would like to quote directly from an eyewitness account that mentioned this. When the Persians took over the city, the Jews who have been not allowed within the city for the previous 500 years have decided to join the Persians and slaughter the Christians like sheep. And this is from an eyewitness account who lived at the time and saw the atrocities committed by the Jews against the Christians, and the Christians also against the Jews. They burned all the churches. They did all of that. And yesterday we focused on looking at Bayt al-Maqdis and the Masjid Al Aqsa through the lenses of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we talked about three particular points: Al-Masjid Al Aqsa being the first qibla of the Muslims, and we discussed that in detail and how we should turn that into action towards the liberation of Al-Masjid Al Aqsa through a daily dua for Al-Masjid Al Aqsa, and not forgetting that Al-Masjid Al Aqsa was the station between heaven and earth, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam during that miraculous night journey, his mi'raj was from Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And our 5 daily prayers are our mi'raj. So including dua within our daily prayers is extremely important. And not forgetting that our prayer came through Bayt al-Maqdis on that night. So putting these dots together makes it much more connected. We also talked about the Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa as a second place of worship on earth, and we discussed that in detail, and the connection between the Prophet and Bayt al-Maqdis, and we said we should revive that through daily learning something new about the Masjid Al-Aqsa, or reading verses, or engaging with this idea. And thirdly, we talked about Abu Bakr's wager and following politically what is happening in the land of Bayt al-Maqdis, and noting that the Masjid Al-Aqsa is one of 3 mosques, and we need to follow, expose the real face of Zionism, and the Zionists make it easy for you today to be able to do this. Fourthly, not supporting them, and fifthly, we discussed sending the gift as in the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to Maymuna. Whoever prays in it, whoever sends a gift to it, will get the reward of as praying inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So this was a quick recap on what we covered yesterday, and the Prophet's strategy then followed with military action towards the liberation of Bayt al-Maqdis and Masjid Al Aqsa, which was fulfilled literally 5 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, starting first with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, who insisted on sending the army of Usama to Mu'tah, to Gaza, and to a place, Yubna, close to Tel Aviv. These were the three places. Then it was followed by Umar ibn Khattab, who entered Bayt al-Maqdis. And looking at this historical precedence, it is important that when the Muslims, the Fath of the Muslims to Bayt al-Maqdis, the Muslims did not burn the churches, they did not destroy it, they protected the lives and the properties. And Umar ibn Khattab, coming from this mountain today known as the Jabal of Takbir, with 4,000 Sahab, he comes in, and the city was surrounded with 35,000 Sahaba and Tabi'een. They come into the city. Umar gives an assurance of safety, protecting them, not compelling them in their religion. This is the difference between Islam and the others in this context. Umar ibn Khattab rebuilding Masjid Al Aqsa and building a Jami' in front, where, as Muslim Ahmad, as in Ahmad it is narrated, he built the Masjid, a Jami' in the place where Rasulullah prayed. However, he cleanses the whole area, including the rock of Bayt al-Maqdis. And this is from Karen Armstrong. She says, Umar ibn Khattab presided over the most peaceful and bloodless conquest of the city. It is never seen something like this, always burning of rival religious symbols and so on. Umar did not do any of this. And the Muslims established a system that enabled Jews and Christians and Muslims to live in Jerusalem for the first time together. Umar rejected the notion of exclusionism, and he brought the people to live under the sovereignty of Islam in the way that he did, and he was faithful to the Quranic Islamic concept of inclusion. This land is lil alameen, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran. And unlike Jews and Christians, Muslims do not attempt to exclude others from the holiness of this place, and they allowed them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهِ النَّاسَ بَعْضَهُم بِبَعْضٍ. If Allah had not quelled people or pushed people by others, then churches, mosques, and other places of worship will be destroyed. I'm skipping these parts because I want to get into Zionism, but this background is extremely important to see how 1,400 years from the time of Umar ibn Khattab, the Muslims had this inclusive policy that allowed everyone in the land of Bayt al-Maqdis. Al-Masjid Al Aqsa was solely for Muslims, and the Muslims rebuilt Al-Masjid Al Aqsa in the finest way. However, because the Muslims, as we said yesterday, are the inheritors of previous prophets, what they did is every prophet that was in Bayt al-Maqdis, in a way or another, was commemorated inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa. So you have the Mihrab of Zakaria, you have the Mahd of Isa, you have the Gate of Asbaq, you have the cradle of Isa alayhi salam, you have the Mihrab of Maryam, and you have the dome, other domes and other things. All of them to remember that these prophets are part of your heritage, the Islamic heritage, and and this is how it continued. Even when Salah ad-Din comes and the Third Crusade comes and approaches Bayt al-Maqdis, Salah ad-Din says it is ours as much as it is yours. This concept, even the Crusades destroyed and killed so many Muslims inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa and slaughtered them. And we talked about the Imam al-Harawi and what he said to regain and Masjid Al-Aqsa is more of a religious duty than praying and fasting in the month of Ramadan, trying to shake people's core. But what we see, even with the slaughter that the Crusaders did, this took a long journey of the Muslims, first the ulama, then Imaduddin, Nuruddin, and Salah ad-Din, reaching al-Masjid Al-Aqsa with a similar strategy to that of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. but adding to it the issue of uniting the Muslim, which was not an issue at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This then led to the liberation of the Masjid Al Aqsa. And this is the area that Salah ad-Din worked on from North Africa, from Tunisia on one side, all the way to Yemen, all the way to Syria. And we will not be able to liberate Bayt al-Maqdis today until these capitals are liberated. And bearing in mind the importance of knowledge in this matter, Salah ad-Din, when he liberated Bayt al-Maqdis, he says to his men, do not think I liberated the Masjid Al-Aqsa with your swords. It is with the knowledge and the pen of Al-Qadi al-Fadil. The importance of knowledge in the liberation is extremely important. We learned this from Rasulullah, we learned this from Nur ad-Din, we learned this from Salah ad-Din. This is how Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa was liberated. And the minbar of Nur ad-Din that we mentioned yesterday was brought to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And I really recommend that you read the first khutbah of Imam Ibn Zaki in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, which gathers the importance and significance, everything we talked about yesterday in the importance and significance of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. You see this clearly in the khutbah after the fath of Salah ad-Din. Here we start moving into our discussion, which is looking at the background to the Zionism. And before that, the Crusades seem to be a continuation. Today's Zionism seems to be a continuation of the concept that was started by the Crusades. You might ask how. We'll try to explain this. After the first and second crusade took place, and then the first crusade before Salah ad-Din, the second crusade was Salah ad-Din against Nur ad-Din, then the third crusade was against Salah ad-Din, and then Richard the Lionheart had come to a conclusion that we cannot keep a control over Bayt al-Maqdis or the Holy Land unless we have Egypt. So their focus shifted to Egypt. In order to take Egypt, we need to take Bayt al-Maqdis. We need to first take Egypt first. And this shift in the Crusader mentality is clear. And we have the fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh crusade taking place, and they didn't stop. The seventh crusade was directly against Egypt, and from there the idea was to go through and take Bayt al-Maqdis. But the Crusaders never ended their wish to take Bayt al-Maqdis from the hands of the Muslims. And we see this clearly in their rhetoric and their campaigns to set new crusades against the Muslims. And we see in the 13th century or the 12th century alone, 35 attempts of crusades to try to take Bayt al-Maqdis from the Muslims. And we see this clearly in this particular cases, the 13th century, 14th century, 15th century. And something that will shock you is this is a book that you can read through. One book that you can read on Salah ad-Din and Umar ibn Khattab, I really recommend highly that you read, as some of you are asking for recommendations of books, is a book called Islamic Jerusalem and Its Christians by Dr. Maher Abu Mushar. This book, Islamic Jerusalem and Its Christians, discusses the examples of Salah ad-Din and Nur ad-Din, Salah ad-Din and Umar ibn Khattab, and the examples that are given are extremely important in the context that we have discussed, the context of inclusivism and how Muslims developed this inclusive idea based on the Quran and the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is important to look through. Islamic Jerusalem and Its Christians, A History of Tolerance and Tension by Dr. Maher Abu Mushar. I think you can see it. I've just put it on the screen. I hope you are able to see it. It should be available online. There is a PDF of it, but it's published in the UK by IB Tourist. So this is a book highly recommended for the examples of Umar ibn Khattab and Salah ad-Din, and how the Islamic context in which this was set up. The second book, that Columbus and his quest for Jerusalem, all of you have been brainwashed into believing that Christopher Columbus just went west to find east, a shorter form, and it was just for gold and money. He writes in his own diaries, and this book goes through his diaries and his letters, that his attempt was to take all of this, was to raise gold and to raise armies, take Bayt al-Maqdis back from the Muslims. As they have succeeded against the Muslims in Andalus and managed to defeat the Muslims out of Andalusia, now was the turn to take back Jerusalem. And this is excuse me. And this was the direction that they pushed forward. And he writes this. He writes to the Pope, he writes to Ferdinando and to Isabella, and he raises sufficient money to set. And his last will, that all the money that he raised would be used for another crusade. However, after this, and through Reformation in Europe and the Ottomans coming to the gates of Vienna, the Crusades shifted in a sense to try to deter the Muslims from taking over Europe, in which they succeeded to a certain point. But an important issue within this particular context is how this then developed into another dimension with Protestantism and the way Puritans started, and the issue of New Jerusalem and the discussions that were taking place at that time, and the seeds for Christian Zionism. But before we get to this, one more point on the first person who offered Palestine to the Jews. And this was after the French Revolution, and this person was Napoleon. And Napoleon is famous or infamous for the use of religion to fulfill his goals. You know that when he occupied Egypt, he claimed himself to be a Muslim, and he changed his name to Ali Bonaparte, and he said, I'm, better than the Turks. I will serve Islam, and I will, in order to get the Muslims over to his side. And when he came to try to occupy the Holy Land and to occupy Bayt al-Maqdis, excuse me again, while he was on the shores of Acre, he calls upon all the Jews of the world, particularly Asia and Africa, to gather under his flag in order to establish for them ancient Jerusalem. And this proclamation that he had given to the Jews, it was quite interesting in a sense, because he's using religion here to try to do this. And this was immediately picked up. He failed against the Ottoman and the propaganda, with all the propaganda he used. And, Napoleon was infamous for his portraits and the propaganda that he was pushing forward. And this, you see, although he failed, this was immediately picked up by British Protestant evangelical, then Christian Zionists, who took this idea and tried to fulfill it in another form. So what they pushed forward was, let us take the Jews to Palestine, but let us first, they worked on a project on Christianizing the Jews. So they set up the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews in the early 1800s. They failed, so then they shifted the project because the Jews were not converting to Christianity. So the project was, now, okay, when Jesus comes, he'll deal with them. Let's now just take them to Palestine. But this was met with Ottomans. But the time came when Muhammad Ali Pasha occupied Palestine. He was the Ottoman governor of Egypt. He rebelled against the Ottomans and occupied Bilad al-Sham, including Palestine, and he was marching towards Constantinople, or Istanbul at that time it was known, or Istanbul. So he marched towards it in order to end the Ottomans and the creation of the modern state. This was based on the European experience. And when he took Beit al-Maqdis, the 10 years that he occupied Beit al-Maqdis were the worst for Beit al-Maqdis, because what he did is he aligned himself with European powers. He allowed the opening of the first consulate of the British in Beit al-Maqdis. He claimed to protect religious groups and minorities. He put them above the Muslims, not to this, even beyond this extent. He created the first Protestant church in Beit al-Maqdis. He created 9 synagogues for Jews in Beit al-Maqdis. He allowed the Jews to pray at Al-Buraq wall, and the demands there, this was a shift, a massive shift in the ideas that Jews were pushing forward in Beit al-Maqdis, and the British were the vessel that was used in order to convince Muhammad Ali Pasha of this. So the setting up of the British consulate then was followed by the establishment of 7 or 8 other Western consulates, and this was the first penetration of the Western powers inside Beit al-Maqdis. We discussed this London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews, and as mentioned by the Jewish bishop in Jerusalem who converted to Christianity and others, only when the Egyptian forces headed by Muhammad Ali Pasha and Ibrahim, his son Ibrahim Pasha, entered Palestine, the permanent Protestant mission in Jerusalem proper could be founded only in 1833. And the establishment, and this is why this is very important to our discussion today when we are discussing Zionism, this was the basis for Zionism. And this is how it started off. And Christian Zionism was, well before Jews adopted Zionism, it was a Christian idea. And you'll see this clearly in the discussion that was being pushed forward in England at the time. You have the discussion taking place to set up the British consulate in Jerusalem. And this, the foreign minister, then he becomes a prime minister, Palmerston. And then you'll see now the discussion between him and John Farron and Wensley and Colonel Patrick Campbell, who was the High Commissioner in Egypt. There was lots of discussion. There is no point of setting this idea up. Was promoted that Jerusalem was not a center for trade. We really don't need it. And the idea that was being pushed forward was actually the underlining premise in which this was being pushed forward was actually a religious one. The son-in-law, quote unquote, of Palmerston was Shaftesbury, and they were connected through mother and daughter. So the wife of Palmerston was the mother of the wife of Shaftesbury, and who is so the illegal daughter of Palmerston in another way. And this was the idea that was being pushed. Shaftesbury was a Christian Zionist, and he was pushing this idea. And even the first consul general that was appointed by Palmerston was from the circles of Shaftesbury, and he was from these evangelical Christian circles. And his mandate was to bring, because the French had the Catholics and the Orthodox were connected with the Russians. However, the British had no one to have leverage over people in the region, so they claimed that they are the protectors of the Jews, and then they started pushing this idea of them being under their command. But this is something interesting that was being pushed forward in that time. The issue of creating a Jewish buffer state in Palestine so what was suggested by Napoleon 40 years earlier was now being pushed by the British in that idea that we create this. And the British were pushing this. You look through the newspapers in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, 1880s, even before Jewish Zionism, you see this clearly obvious that this was being pushed across two fronts. One is the religious front, which was within certain circles, but what was being pushed in the wider context was this is good for the British, this is for our trade with India, the ideas of pushing this as a political and an economic benefit for the British. You see this across the British media at that time. This is beside it being a religious matter, but this is how it was being pushed to the public within that region. And the idea of finding this buffer state, a foreign body that will divide the Muslims in the region, and it would be like a dagger in the heart of the unity of the Muslims in that area, separating Egypt from Asham, and this will be the buffer zone in a sense. And what you see here is the maps of Bayt al-Maqdis at the time of the Ottomans, and you can see that Palestine was not in the borders that we have then later on set by the British. Following Christian Zionism and its achievements, slow achievements over time, they managed to eventually convince the Jews of this idea. The Jews were not convinced of the idea of that they need to have a nation state. Even with the Balfour Declaration, this we will come and visit in a moment, but the only Jew in the British cabinet at the time, he was against the Balfour Declaration and saw it as anti-Semitic. And bearing in mind, just going back a second, Shaftesbury, at the time of Palmerston, he was against the Jews voting in British elections, but he wanted to get rid of the Jews and send them off to Palestine. You can see how anti-Semitic they were, or anti-Jewish. I don't like the term, but this is the way it is used. These people, even this was used in 1917 by the only British Jewish Jew in the cabinet. He said the Balfour Declaration was anti-Semitic and he wanted to get rid of the Jews. And this is not the aspiration of the Jews. And this is quite interesting. Until the establishment of the State of Israel, most Jews were actually anti-Zionist. However, Zionism started as Jewish nationalism, of the idea of creating a nation state for the Jews and establishing it within that area. And this well before Theodor Herzl started, but Theodor Herzl is the one that institutionalized it. And then with the first Jewish Congress in 1890, 97, 98, 99, these were the main points starting in Basel in Europe and moving these discussions of the need for a Jewish national home. However, Herzl, as a secular Jew, and this is important, many of them were secular Jews, the idea of a Jewish national home, wherever it may be, it didn't really play much of interest, whether it was in Palestine or somewhere, or Uganda, or even South America. He just wanted the idea of a Jewish state, a state like others have, but this is Jews not as a religion, Jews as a people to have a state. Like others have the right to nation states, we also want a nation state. But finding out that actually most Jews would not subscribe to this idea unless he will be able to win them over if it was in Palestine in a sense. So the idea was to try to push this idea in that particular direction as we saw it in these. My apologies again. So this was the idea of a Jewish homeland or a state for the Jews was something that did not necessarily mean it has to be Palestine amongst Jewish nationalists or Jewish Zionists at the time. However, in order to get the Jews across the world behind this idea, the idea of Palestine resonated with more of them, even secular or non-secular, in terms of the inheritance or the connection that they had with this particular land. And we see this in the discussion that took place with Sultan Abdul Hamid, who met with Theodore Herzl, and he refused completely the idea of giving up Palestine, although he offered to consolidate all the Ottoman debt in order for the Jews to settle in Palestine under the Ottoman sovereign. Sultan Abdul Hamid was adamant that this project was way bigger than they were trying to make it out to be, and refused this. And Sultan Abdul Hamid had to pay a very heavy price for this. And this is a letter of Sultan Abdul Hamid that he wrote after he was dethroned. And this is in Ottoman Turkish. And he clearly says that the Holy Lands, Philistine, he was dethroned, and they threatened him with abolishing or putting particularly the Joint Turkler, Ittihad wa Taraqi, under their threats if he do not give Palestine as a Jewish national home, because he would not agree to this. He was dethroned. And this is clearly the reason that he gives. And he clearly also says here that they offered him to give him 150 million English lira or pounds of gold, 150 golden English pounds, if he would give up Palestine to as a suitable Jewish national home, which he refused. And we see how this developed. So we started with the historical context, and we came to how the background for Christian Zionism. There is a lot of discussion in this that I've skipped, but I'll suggest some books that you can read on this. And then we moved towards the discussion about how Jewish Zionism started to form, and now the alliance that was formed between Christian and Jewish Zionism is the important point that we will cover. Although both these projects are completely different, both these projects, the Christian Zionist project and the Jewish Zionist project, their ends are completely different. However, they intersect at the current period where we are today. But this intersection is beyond this is a temporary intersection of benefit of an alliance between both. But both of them, the end game is completely different. The end game for Jewish Zionists, for Christian Zionists, is completely different. So this is, you see this, how Netanyahu is using Christian Zionists, and he plays his words clearly to them. You see this clearly in the context. This idea of nation states was something that was made up by the European experience. And this was as a result of the idea of the French Revolution as separating church from the state. And this is important to every one of you to read the context in which this was created. And today, the main division in the Muslim world is because of this ideology that came from the West. And this faith identities that were created and given by the West to the region and to the Muslims is a disaster on its own. However, that's not our topic, but just to touch on it very briefly, how they divided through the 𝐀𝐚𝐥𝐽 agreement. And this is the real map that I have taken directly from the British National Archive in Kew Gardens. You can see the division. What makes it very, very difficult for me is seeing how they, sorry, I'm not sure if you're still able to see my screen. I think I have made a mistake. One second. Okay, yes. And you can see in this map how they divided this. And the most difficult part, you can see how they used to draw these lines, then wipe them out, and restart again, and playing with the fate of the people in this region. And you can see this clearly how they divided this between the British, the French, and making an independent or international zone to be in the area of Palestine. The second promise, so that was in 1916, this was in 1917, promising Palestine as a national Jewish home to the Jewish people. And this was the Balfour Declaration, which we already have mentioned, that this was part of the Christian Zionist and Jewish Zionist alliance. However, anti-Zionist Jews at the time, in particular the minister that we have mentioned, and there's a book that discusses 100 years after Balfour that deals with his own work that I can also, at the end, if you remind me, I'll share with you the name of that book, which clearly discusses that Jews in the UK and the only Jewish minister in the British cabinet was against this Balfour Declaration in 1917. However, this moved beyond this, and with the occupation of the British to Palestine in 1917, in the month of December, the British occupation started, and the British then started pushing this agenda with the son of Faisal, the son of Sharif Hussein Faisal, and Hayim Weizmann. And this is post Theodore Herzl. And by the way, Theodore Herzl died quite young, and it seems that they got rid of him. Those Zionists who were against the idea of a Jewish state outside Palestine, and Theodore Herzl was up for the idea in a sense. Wherever we can establish a state, it doesn't matter. So they seem to have got rid of him and replaced him with Weizmann. And this is a letter that I have taken from the British Archive, and the week I spent there made me very sick, seeing how the Arab nationalists and the Jewish nationalists, meaning here Zionists, have created an alliance. And this is particularly between Faisal, and this is a letter from Faisal to the British, and he says, I had the honor of meeting Dr. Weizmann, and he discusses the future of the Arab and the Jewish people, and have discussed how they were, he's extremely happy to have met him, and ending with praying for the great British Army that always victorious and so on. And this is another letter from the British to Faisal, saying that we're happy that you have met with Wiseman and we hope that you are able to work together for the betterment of both your people, the Arab and the Jewish people. This, just seeing this, you can see how the British were facilitating this new idea and pushing it forward in that extent. And after their occupation, this was the direction that they were pushing forward. However, it didn't stay long before the people of Palestine have seen, and the new identity of Palestine was now formed according to the British boundaries. So Palestine is now the British mapped out Palestine from being 27,000 square kilometers. This was the identity of modern Palestine is a British invention in a sense. However, the people in Beit al-Maqdis and the surrounding area, what became then Palestine, were started rebelling against the British. Particularly, this is in the 1920s of Mohsen Nabi Musa, followed by the Balagh revolt, and followed by the other revolts, particularly in 1936 and others. And here, the example of Sheikh 𝐁𝐻𝐿 is extremely important in the fight against Zionism. And he clearly had a major problem with Zionism, and there was an earthquake at the Masjid Al Aqsa that you can see in the image caused a lot of damage. And 𝐁𝐚𝐿 Husseini wanted to raise money to renovate the Masjid Al Aqsa, and Sheikh 𝐁𝐻𝐿 was against the renovation of the Masjid Al Aqsa. And he said this money should be used to end the British and the Zionist occupation of this land. What will the use of renovating the mosque be if we lose this land? And you can see the different approach of Sheikh 𝐁𝐻𝐿 to that of 𝐁𝐴 Husseini. And then you see the killing of a lot of Palestinians by the British, and then causing the 1948. So what the British did within 30 years is they set the foundation for the establishment of this Zionist state, causing the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their land, the occupation of over hundreds of Palestinian villages and cities, and the murder, and watch the documentary Tantura of how Jewish, like you see today, Zionist soldiers in Gaza blowing up and talking about killing children and women. And today I've not killed any children. I didn't find any children to kill. This psychopathic mindset is something very dangerous, but we see it very clearly then in 1948 and today. And we'll talk about the underlining part of this idea. Christian and Jewish Zionists, so you can see here the outcome of Christian Zionists to the left with the burning of the Masjid Al Aqsa in 1969, and you can see Jewish Zionists in the right with the occupation of Al Masjid Al Aqsa. The massacres that took place in the Masjid Al Aqsa in 1990 and others, there is many of this. Now the end game, and this is today in the picture becoming very clear. The end game of both Christian and Jewish Zionists is this. Over the site of the Masjid Al Aqsa, a Jewish temple needs to be built. And I'll break this. I'll come to the point of how this is reached. So this is another intersection of where Jewish and Christian Zionists intersect and agree with each other. And this is an end game both sides are working towards. But we will try to map out how they see this coming and the ideas that are being pushed forward in this particular direction. The tunnels underneath the Masjid Al Aqsa are weakening the foundation of the Masjid Al Aqsa, as exposed by Sheikh Salah. But there is a lot of discussion in this particular point that we can engage with. What one point that I would like to come to, and now we move our discussion towards Gaza. But before we do that, you saw in the last number of years the attacks against Al Masjid Al Aqsa and how this has moved forward over the last couple of years, starting with Bab al-Asbah, and the people after Al Masjid Al Aqsa was sealed off in 2017 in the middle of July. Al Masjid Al Aqsa was sealed off for 2 weeks, and the Muslims had to gather outside the Masjid Al Aqsa, refusing to enter because of these metal detectors. They refused this. Al Aqsa continued to be sealed off for 2 full weeks until the people broke the siege on Al Masjid Al Aqsa, and the Zionists were forced to remove the metal detectors and remove everything from the gate of Al Masjid Al Aqsa and return it to the way it was before. And you see the will of the people of Beit. You saw this again at Bab al-Rahma and at other points inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. But something quite interesting that took place was the announcement of Donald Trump of Jerusalem being the eternal capital, not of Israel. United Jerusalem is not the eternal capital only of Israel, but of the Jewish people. And moving the embassy and the deal of the century are all important factors in what is going on today and in the fulfillment of the Zionist project in the land of Beit al-Maqdis. And all these points put together, you can see, particularly after the deal of the century, and the idea of clearly pushing the Zionist Jewish idea of sharing Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, dividing Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, that Jews and and Zionists have access to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, while Muslims are banned entry. And by the way, until the deal of the century, it was not legal for Jews to pray inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa, and they would be arrested if they did so. Post the deal of the century, now they can pray, they can do their rituals inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and while being protected by a large number of soldiers inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. The Maqadisa, the people of Beit al-Maqdis, have taught us that they are not silent. And what they did is they kept pushing the bar with the Zionists. And even though Jordan was on the game, when we are talking about Bab al-Rahma, when you saw here, there was a lock placed by the Zionists on the gate of Rahma. Then it was removed and the people entered. Then a new one was placed by the Jordanians. And the people said there is no difference between the Jordanian lock and the Zionist lock. And they broke both of them and they managed to enter the Bab al-Rahma, which the Zionists were pushing for it to be turned into a Jewish synagogue within Al-Masjid and the areas surrounding it. And they're still pushing, by the way, this idea. But where things developed was in 2021, when Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa was again in the month of Ramadan, the attacks against the people inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and what took place there was quite interesting in the way, the outcome of this. Because as people were being attacked, this is in 2021, and in the month of Ramadan, the attacks in the month of Ramadan went beyond anything that has been experienced in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Just like today, 28th of Ramadan, 2021, there was a clear attack on the Muslims inside the masjid. In order to allow a few hundred settlers to enter and to do the worship after the busiest day of the year for Muslims inside the Masjid. And the Zionist soldiers used tear gas, they used everything. They got rid of the people praying inside the Masjid Al Aqsa. It went beyond anything that was expected. And the people inside the Masjid Al Aqsa started shouting for help and support from two particular places. The first one was from Gaza, Mishan Allah, ya Gaza, Allah, for God's sake, come on, Gaza. And the other place was Turkey. The people of Gaza did not let them down, and immediately the resistance movement got involved and gave Israel until 6 p.m. if they do not release everyone that was arrested in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and take out their soldiers out of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and return the people to access Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, then they would attack the Zionists. And this was a precedent in which the people now things were changing, and they called it the sword of Al-Quds. The Zionists thought that this is not real and they're not going to be intimidated. Immediately, the resistance got involved, and it changed the course of everything. The Zionists had to withdraw, they had to cancel the march, they had to release the hostages that they have taken, the hundreds of people that they have arrested inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa, and this turned the table around for the first time. The following Ramadan, 2022, and the following Ramadan, Israel attempted to do something similar in the month of Ramadan inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa, and you saw the attacks last Ramadan and the even last night, throwing tear gas at the worshippers inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa. However, this time Israel has decided that the last 10 days of Ramadan, no settlers will enter, although soldiers are entering, but settlers will not be entering because they are afraid of this escalating into another direction. So you can see the Gaza deterrent has worked even in this particular Ramadan. But moving to this latest attack on Gaza, the reason the resistance said that they took this decision to attack on the 7th of October, and I quote here, this was for Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. This is called the Al-Aqsa flood because we are losing Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And you saw just weeks, the week before the 7th of October, how Khalid El-Awaisi, Aida Sidawi were attacked by settlers and soldiers at the gates of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Muslim women and men were attacked, and Zionists were literally inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa, settlers more than the Muslims in the hours of the morning. A clear division in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa had been established. And since the 7th of October, actually, a lot of restrictions has been placed on Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, with some prayers, literally no one entering Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa because of the restrictions placed. But a decision was made for this Ramadan to lift some of these restrictions, although initially it was more restrictions were to be placed because of a fear that the West Bank would explode if they would go forward with this particular issue. So now, going back to put this into perspective, going back to Shaftesbury in one side, the idea of establishing an Anglicized Jewish colony in Palestine, strongly sympathetic to British interests and dependent on British aid, and typically having British troops to protect it, grew appeal as a result of subsequent historical development in the UK. Now you have Joe Biden clearly saying, if there was no Israel, we would have to invent one. And he says this at the beginning, and you saw this immediately after the 7th of October. He says, I'll say this 5,000 times in my career. And he says, repeats this, that the United States, the commitment of the United States has to Israel is based on our principles, our ideas, our values. They are the same values. This is what he pushes forward. And on the other side, you heard Herzog saying that we are fighting this war for the West. We are fighting this war for democracy. We are fighting this war for you. And this is the idea of this intersection between both. But you can see in this war how the real face of Zionism has been exposed over the last few few weeks, and you can see the stark example of how Netanyahu talking about using the Amalek or Amalek example to talk about, excuse me, to talk about using biblical references to commit suicide in Palestine. Using such rhetoric, you can see how Zionists are using these religious texts in order to fulfill such ideas that they are pushing forward. And this, if a Muslim would use such a text, you would see the whole world saying, look at these texts and what they are meaning, and how these texts are calling for genocide and doing such arguments. And you can see the way the Zionists have pushed this forward, and using this rhetoric, and using the rhetoric of human animals, and using this. And here you need to be aware of the following. This is quite interesting, that although you have two forms of Zionism today in the occupied Palestine, one is secular Zionism and one is religious Zionism. Now, even the bridging between these two ideas is becoming clear, using biblical narrative to push for a genocide in Palestine is beyond anything that you believe. So within this, you have this form of Zionism. Now, looking at another in the West, particularly in the United States, you have a very strong Christian religious Zionist support for the state, and they're in their hundreds of millions. And their end goal is the establishment of, they're pushing for World War III. They're pushing for this idea of the building of a temple over the site of the Masjid Al Aqsa. They're pushing this idea forward in terms of Armageddon. And this is a religious prospect in that direction. You have another form of Zionism, which is less in numbers, but stronger in another dimension, which is secular Zionism in the West. And this is being pushed forward by certain lobby groups. However, in recent years, that they're also pushing towards religious narrative in a sense. And what is quite interesting is how in the last few weeks, and I'd like to mention to you how the American president in this context is talking about sorry, not the American president, but one of his vice presidents is has been invited to a Christian Zionist dinner, and talking the rhetoric that was being used in this is extremely interesting. How they were pushing this idea forward, the idea of Christian Zionism is becoming mainstream in the American secular context even. So you can see this now being pushed in a completely different direction, and you saw many of the even secular during the race for the election and the different candidates and the nominees before it was settled between Trump and Biden. The issue that was being pushed forward, that what would you do in the case of Israel, we tell Bibi Netanyahu to finish the job off. This is the way that we were pushing. We can see this being pushed forward in that direction very, very strongly within the West. You see also this across the UK, across Germany, the support for Zionism, and this is state support for Zionism, is also based on another two factors. And this current war in Gaza has exposed a lot of this. Please, we're trying to come to wrap up the discussion. So if you have any points or any questions you would like to ask, we'll try within the next 10 minutes to wrap our discussion and to leave the last 15 minutes for your questions and answers. So please start writing your questions if you know. So what we see, for example, why does Germany support the state of Israel? And there's some books that have talked about how Germany tried to reconcile with the Jewish people and trying to make amends for what they have done during the Holocaust. But in reality, they're not. There is a lot at play in this particular point. But today, and I've heard this from a British politician in a private conversation. He's passed away, so I'll tell you what he said. I asked him why British politicians would not openly support Palestine, and he said for two reasons. One, the guilt of the Holocaust and the way this has been played. And the second thing that they're more afraid of, whether the guilt of the Holocaust is real or not, is another matter. But the thing they're really afraid of is being labeled as anti-Semitic. And he said to me, this is political suicide. Anyone who would stand, and you have seen this with Ken Livingstone, you have seen this in the UK example, you have seen this in the case of Ken Livingstone, you have seen this in the case of Corbyn, and you have seen this in many of the cases. And currently, the British Labour leader is supported by Zionists, and the leaked documents is clear in this. They brought him to replace Corbyn in a sense. Stepping back in history or stepping forward in history, you see a lot of examples like this, both within the European context or even within the American context. And this is a convenient marriage at the moment between the West and the Western Zionist ideology and Jewish Zionist ideology. And even before the current Prime Minister of the UK, everyone, the first thing that they'll try to do, and you saw this with the woman, I forgot her name, she became the Prime Minister for a very short period of time. And the first thing that she did is she gave her oath of allegiance to the Zionists, and she said she will move the British embassy to Jerusalem. And you can see all of them are playing this card. You can see this in America, you can see this in the United States, you see this across Europe, you see this in many of the examples that we clearly see in these particular contexts. And there is a lot. They're willing to justify everything for this Zionist state, whatever it may be. They're willing to go beyond that. And you see today in the example of the murder that is taking place, the genocide that is taking place in Gaza, the Western media, the Western governments are willing to justify everything for it. Now there is a shift, but this shift is because of it is directly threatening them. And this is an incremental process that you'll be seeing. But the idea, and you see everyone singing from the same hymn sheets. Israel has the right to defend it. Israel, do you condemn Hamas? Do you do this? Do you do that? And you can see this exact same propaganda pushed across, whether it's Piers Morgan on one side, or talk shows, or even in mainstream media. You see this being pushed forward, avoiding this idea of the genocide that is taking place. Now it got to a stage where this is impossible to be avoided, and it is going beyond anything that they can justify. At the beginning, you saw them justifying the bombing of hospitals. You saw them justifying the bombing of schools, universities. Everything was being justified. They got to a point with the killing of 7 aid workers because they were not Palestinian. This shows you the hypocrisy of the West. And this got to a tipping point. And there is a saying in Arabic that the straw that broke the camel's back, they have been carrying and justifying everything for the Zionists, but it will get to a point where one small incident will break this completely. And you saw this within this context, which is what was being pushed by the Americans, is that they are going to be setting a port, and this port, everything that happened with the World Kitchen was organized between America, Israel, and the World Kitchen. So everything was being already organized. But Israel now has no limits. And Israel gets its courage from the Muslim world, number one, because of their complicity in their silence. And by the way, silence is complicity. That's number one. Number two, you see this in the complicity of the Western world, in the governments I'm talking about here, and their complicity in supporting Israel with weapons and so on. And the third, now Israel has a free check to do whatever it wants to do. Now, Joe Biden tried to push the idea to stop Israel in the month of Ramadan. Let's just stop during the month of Ramadan. Let's not push this further, because of the pressure that he was receiving. He's not doing it because he loves Ramadan or the Muslims, or he's interested in this. It is his rating that are dropping. And the issue of Gaza is being pushed on. And someone like Donald Trump, who is not pro-Israel, he's beyond that. What he did in the deal of the century went beyond what any American president has ever done. However, he hates Netanyahu at one end, because Netanyahu used him for his election campaign, and this is something Trump that didn't forget for him. However, he is, because this is for him, we need to get this sorted out. So he was pushing, supporting Israel. The tides are shifting in the United States with a lot of pro-ceasefire or pro-Palestine, in a sense, pushing this idea forward in that direction. So this shift is not because of the aid workers, or this shift is not because of Palestine. This shift is because of their own rating and this issue of Palestine being pushed forward. And this was the straw that broke their back in a sense. What is expected out of Zionism on the short and long term? Israel has made a wise decision to stop incursions in the last 10 days of Ramadan because it does not want to escalate in the West Bank and in particular. Uh, However, what Israel is planning in the short term is the uh, escalation of these incursions post Ramadan. So immediately on the second day of Ramadan, this you will see incursions inside the Masjid Al Aqsa taking place again. And the Muslims will not have the numbers. In Ramadan, when you had the numbers, you were able to deter them. After Ramadan, you will see this changing substantially. And this is there is two issues. You have religious Zionists who had already with Christian Zionists in the United States genetically modified 5 cows, red heifers that they have shipped over from the United States to Palestine. They're being kept and they're preparing them for slaughter. What this means is very dangerous for Al Masjid Al Aqsa because, according to Jewish rabbis, and this is the established verdict, is that Jews are not allowed to enter Al Masjid Al Aqsa because they are impure, they are najis. This is the chief rabbinite verdict on the issue of entering Al Masjid Al Aqsa. Very interesting. You might say, well, how are they entering Al Masjid Al Aqsa? These are reformist Jewish groups who are pushing this idea forward. But who is pushing this idea? They're pushing it in one direction, and in order to convince the rest of the Jews to enter Al Masjid Al Aqsa, that's why the numbers of Jews entering Al Masjid Al Aqsa is rather limited. But if they remove this, the idea of the impurity of Jews, my apologies, the impurity of Jews, if this is finished, and this is only done through this red heifer at the age of 2, it's slaughtered, it is burned, the ashes of it are joined in water, and this is how Jews are purified. Then Jews are expected to enter the Masjid Al Aqsa in their hundreds of their thousands. And this will change the numbers completely. This is very dangerous for the case of Al Masjid Al Aqsa Al Mubarak. So, in the terms of the short term, if this is this, and they're planning to do this on the second day of Eid, if this takes place between the second day of Eid and within around a month, if this takes place, then this will change the attacks on Al Masjid Al Aqsa to a completely different level. And we will be losing Al Masjid Al Aqsa and access to Al Masjid Al Aqsa, and it will be a fulfillment of the deal of the century that entry into Al Masjid Al Aqsa will be according to religious holidays of the Jews, exactly as it has happened in the Mosque of Ibrahim in Al Khalil in Hebron. So this is on the terms of the short term. On the long term, you have the Christian Zionists talking about, and Jewish Zionists talking about the building of the temple, with pushing the idea of the Battle of Armageddon, and Netanyahu even pushing this with Jewish Zionists that he will end this Talmudic curse. He will make sure, because according to Jewish Messianic thinking, Israel will not survive 80 years. And we are currently at 70 since 1948. We are at 77 years or 76 years. Israel will end, according to them, within 4 years. And Netanyahu is saying, I will make sure that Israel will survive another 100 years. But this is something that they believe in their own prophecies, that this is what will take place. And this, the idea of building the temple in the Jewish idea, this Jewish standard idea, is that this will come down from the heaven. However, these reformist Jews have prepared everything, including the clothes that will be worn by by the rabbis, and the stones and the menorah and everything is ready. On the other side, Christian Zionists are pushing for this in that direction and wanting to fulfill this sooner than later. And this is what is being pushed forward in that particular direction for the long term Battle of Armageddon, destruction of Masjid Al Aqsa, and taking things in a completely different dimension. Another idea that Israel sees that it has an existential threat, and this is even pushed by within the idea of future studies, future secular studies amongst the Israeli population. They are pushing this idea that Israel will not survive another even half a century. Israel will end because the issue that brought Israel together in 1948 no longer exists today. And this is both academic, future studies, in the issue of demography and the discussion of politics. All of this is being pushed forward in that particular direction. This takes us back to Gaza again. And what is happening in Gaza today is a prime example of the ulu that the Quran talked about. لتفسدن في الأرض مرتين ولتعلن علوا كبيرا. You will make mischief in this land twice, and you will reach great heights. And you see the great heights that they have reached and the destruction that they are causing in the land of Beit al-Maqdis, and the ideas that they are pushing forward in that discussion. I've come to the end of the discussion, but you can see how this alliance between Christian and Jewish Zionism has brought us to where we are today. Now we will look through the questions. Please write your questions in the question and answer section. I'll try to go through them first, and then I'll go through the chat part. Okay, so let's start with the first question. MashaAllah, very long. Sahariya Iqbal, Assalamu alaikum, Jazakallah khair, thank you, Barakallah fikum. It motivated me a lot to study the history and current politics more in depth, although I don't enjoy studying politics. Yes, this is something, inshallah, that by reading this, something let me say here on what you said. Yes, maybe we don't like to study history or politics, but the one that does not know his history does not know his future. And the Quran, you saw in the example we discussed yesterday, the Quran made sure that the Sahaba are going to be following international politics through Surah Al-Rum. To follow a war between the Romans and the Persians, we have nothing to do with. But this widens your prospect and makes you see things in a better way. My question refers to the time of the Ottoman Empire collapse after World War I, and Beit al-Maqdis became part of the British mandate. The Ottomans lost due to supporting Germany in war, and the British took over parts of the territory. Can it be seen as a conquest of the British? It's an occupation of the British. And yes, the Ottomans, after they dethroned Sultan Abdul Hamid, they messed everything up. Everything became in the hands of the nationalists, and the nationalists, Ittihad and Taraqi, messed everything up. And they aligned themselves with certain Western powers, and they went into a different direction. If the Holy Land became under the British control and the Muslims were defeated, I think that the British kingdom owns this land and they can divide it according to their will. In other words, the British can give the land to the Muslims and Jews according to their will. So why are people discussing and questioning and defying it? The winner of war gets it. This is a very dangerous discussion, Sahira Iqbal. And this is the idea that you just give up and you allow the victor to take over. This is Islamically unacceptable. And you see this in the example of Algeria, when the French took over it and conquered it by force. You saw this in the example of India. You saw this in the example of Libya with the Italians, and then India, the British, and the others, and in South Africa and other examples. A free people, and actually Islam does not accept injustice. You can say, and this is unfortunately some Muslim twist-minded uh, individual say, well, Israel is currently the victor. You have to obey what Israel tells you to do. This is where the danger of this discussion comes from. A Muslim never accepts, and this is an established in the Islamic fiqh, that when a land of Muslims is occupied, it becomes fardu aynun to liberate that land. And this applies to a lot of Muslim lands that have been occupied. From eastern Turkestan, you can say the Muslims in eastern Turkestan need to give up and just obey the Chinese. Or the Muslims in Kashmir need to obey the Indians and just give up and stop resisting the occupation. This passive idea of that is being pushed amongst some circles, particularly in Saudi Arabia, of the Madkhalis. And you saw this in their support for Khalifa Haftar in Libya, but they didn't support Muhammad Morsi, for example. So they're very selective in the way that they push this idea forward. But it's a very dangerous discussion. Thank you very much for raising it. So I want to ask for clarification on the concept of understand. The second question from, I'm sorry for pronouncing the name by mistakenly, Shahira Iqbal. My sincere apologies for saying it wrong. If you write it in Arabic, I can say it correctly. My second question, do you think the re-establishment of the Khilafah is necessary to liberate? Very good question. Your questions are wonderful. To liberate Bayt al-Maqdis, the Holy Land. I say Bayt al-Maqdis because it's the word of Rasulullah, as we discussed yesterday. In my circles, many people part of Hizb al-Tahrir campaign and claim the liberation of Al-Aqsa and a solution for the current crisis in Gaza is the Khilafah. Very good. I will come to discuss this point. I discussed this matter with some imams in our masjid in Berlin, Germany, where I live. They were very critical of their campaign and do not support the idea of the re-establishment of the Khilafah as Hizb al-Tahrir suggests. For my own political orientation, I'm confused, so I want to ask your opinion. MashaAllah. You are touching on very important points and very important questions. The establishment of the Khilafah will take place. This is a certainty because this is the promise of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the last center of the Khilafah will be Bayt al-Maqdis, and it will never leave it. It will be the last center of the Khilafah, and this is established in our hadith literature very strongly, and the Sahih hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Hasan hadith, and even including the weak hadith. A very good study that was done by one alim, hadith scholar in Gaza. The book is in Arabic, unfortunately, but it's a wonderful, wonderful study. He goes through the hadith, and this is his opinion on the re-establishment of the Khilafah. And based on the Quranic wa'd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Isra at the end of this Ifsad of Bani Israel in verse 7 Surah Al-Isra, which goes through three stages. One, the re-establishment of Israel is actually a Quranic prophecy. And the end of the state of Israel is also a Quranic prophecy. Very interesting discussions on the future prospect from the Quranic and the Hadith perspective. But it will go through the end, will go through three stages. The first one, to disgrace their faces. And the ones being addressed in these verses are Bani Israel, not the Muslims. So Allah says, لِيَسُوءُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَلِيَدْخُلُوا الْمَسْجِدَ كَمَا دَخَلُوهُ أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ وَلِيُتَبِّرُوا مَا عَلَوْا تَتْبِيرًا. First, they shall disgrace your faces. Then they will enter the mosque like they entered it the first time. And then they will utterly destroy everything that you have raised. These are the three stages. for the liberation of Bayt al-Maqdis. This Al-Aqsa will be liberated before the establishment of the Khilafah, according to the chronology given in the Hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the idea of pushing now for the liberation of for the establishment of the Khilafah is also problematic in this in this sense. However, Al-Aqsa will not be liberated by Palestinians. Reading the historical Sunan of Allah, Sunnatullah is something that does not change for anyone. So Bayt al-Maqdis will be liberated, but it will not be liberated only by the Palestinians, the people in Gaza. It has to have a unity of Muslims who will come and support them in their liberation. This will not be achieved through the states because the states are corrupt to their core. The Muslim leaders are corrupt to their core. So there is no way that you can reform these Muslim leaders in any way. And the only way forward is a second wave of what was called the Arab Spring, or maybe an Islamic Spring, that will end the tyranny in Egypt and in Syria and across the Muslim world. Together with this, the Muslims will march towards Bayt al-Maqdis, Al-Aqsa will be liberated, and then it will be the Khilafah will be re-established in the land of Bayt al-Maqdis. This is then he mentions in the book the process that will take place. Once the Khilafah will be established, and I heard this from a great scholar of Hadith, 𝐁𝐚𝐿𝐴𝐻 he says it will be double the length of Khilafah Rashida. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Hadith, and let me give this Hadith and finish with this question. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, prophethood will be amongst you as long as Allah wills it, and then Allah will lift it whenever He wishes to lift it. This is when it ended in 632 with the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then he says it will be Khilafatun Rashida. It will be a rightly guided Khilafah on the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Allah will lift it whenever He wishes to lift it. And this ended with the death of the Shahada of Ali bin Abi Talib. Then he says it will be from father to son, or Sultanah, Hukman Aduba, from family to another. And this ended with the end of the Ottoman period. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, ثم يكون حكما جبريا. You will be ruled by tyrants whether you like it or not. And this is exactly the period we are living in. And inshallah, this will end soon. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, ثم تكون خلافة راشدة على منهاج النبوة. Then it will return back to a rightly guided Khilafah. So it will go back to exactly like the time of Abu Bakr and Umar. ثم سكت. And this will be the end. Within this context, the scholar Hadith puts all these examples and puts them in the order that after the Khilafah is established, then he talks about Imam al-Suyuti. This is not him. Imam al-Suyuti talks about 40 hadith that will be in Bayt al-Maqdis before Imam al-Mahdi comes, and before Dajjal comes, and before al-Malham al-Kubra, before Isa alayhi salam. Then that will go through, and the world, not a single house will, Islam will not enter at the time of Isa alayhi salam. Then you will have Ya'juj, Gog and Magog, and then you will have the start of the Day of Judgment. All of this, the focus, the future of the Muslims will be in the land of Bayt al-Maqdis. I hope that answers your question. Yes, Amin, Aswa, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. What does the Quran say about the Masjid Al Aqsa and the threats being made by the Zionists in relation to this war and the Red Cow? The Quran does not say anything except the verses in the beginning of Surah Al-Isra and the end of Surah Al-Isra, that Allah will gather Bani Israel from every corner of the earth to this land. And once they have gathered, Allah will give them a lot of influence around the world. Their numbers will be increased, and we gave you lots of money and wealth, and you see the control they have over the world wealth. We made you lots in numbers. You have a lot of influence. They have influence across the whole world. Allah says to them, if you do good, you do it for yourself, and if you do bad, it will be against you. And when the second mischief comes, when the second promise comes, then you shall be, your faces shall be disgraced. They shall enter the mosque as they entered the first time. and they will destroy the mischiefs that the heights that you have reached. This is what the Quran says about this. It does not mention cows or any of these other prophets. Why is Saudi Arabia not allowing worshippers to make dua at the Kaaba? Saudi Arabia is part of a Western uh, the Western hegemony in the region. And to put it in the words of Donald Trump, he said, "I called King Salman and I said to him, you pay. If we do not support you for 2 weeks, then you're going to fail." And he paid. Then the second time he told him 2 days, and the third time he told him 2 hours. This is how pathetic the Saudis are within this. They pay the jizya to the West, and in return, the West supports them against their own people. And this is unfortunately why when you have Sheikh Sudais going out talking about samosas and eating samosas, and then you have yesterday the Imam making dua against revolutions and against protests in the Muslim world. This is how pathetic they're becoming. And arresting the woman who raised a Palestinian flag next to the Kaaba, and arresting people who are making dua for Al Masjid Al Aqsa. And not one or two examples, a lot of them. And you can see that they see Al Aqsa as a threat to their thrones. And Al Aqsa will bring them down. Every now and then you'll have them making dua for Palestine and Masjid Al Aqsa within a controlled zone. The third question from you didn't write your name in Arabic, Shahariya Iqbal. Last question refers to the historical picture of a meeting between Grand Mufti and Hitler in 1941. Yes. As a Muslim born and growing in Germany, we study German history of the last history of the extensive detail. It is disturbing to see Muslims collaborating with Hitler, who caused one of the greatest crimes against humanity. Unfortunately, I don't know the historical background, so I wanted to ask you what kind of collaboration this was, and was it a mistake to ask Hitler for support from an Islamic perspective? Very, mashallah, your questions are very deep. Barakallah fiki for your questions. The question, this will need a full lecture, but Hajj Amin al-Husseini is a very controversial character in the sense that he was pro Sharif Hussein at the beginning, and he raised about 4,000 Palestinians to fight along the side of the British against the Ottomans. Then he started fighting against the British. And his brother, who was the Mufti at the time, was a supporter of the British and even congratulating them on the occupation of Beit al-Maqdis. Very disturbing story. Then this moves into him becoming the Mufti and leading the resistance. But I told you the story of Sheikh Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam standing against him in the renovation of the Masjid Al-Aqsa. But that's another discussion. Then, after 1936, the British put him on their hit list, and they wanted to get rid of him because of his influence amongst the Palestinians. So he runs off to their enemies, and he runs off to the Germans, and he tries to get the support of the Germans against the British and against the French, and he becomes the Mufti of the German army. Now the context of Germany in that there was an alliance in World War I between the Ottomans and the Germans. Now he saw this as a precedent that we can get the support of the Germans to fight the British and the others. Later in his own diary, he says that I even asked to support the resistance in North Africa, the Germans, if they support them against, particularly in North Africa, in Algeria and in Libya, in Algeria in particular, against the French, instead of them seeking help from the Soviets or the Russians. And the answer he got from one of the generals in Germany is that we do not want a united Muslim front in North Africa. The Germans were also clever. They used the Muslims to the extent that they wanted to use them. So did the British, so did the French, so did everyone else. And the Muslims were naive in their political experience. But this is a very long discussion that needs to be done. But the Zionists are using it a lot today. In that the Muslims, Hajj Amin Husseini was a Nazi. He supported this. He supported the Germans against the massacres of Jews. This was not the case, but this is how it is being promoted. Someone anonymous, he said at present direct support Gaza seems to come from Shia, okay, Houthis and Hezbollah, and to some extent Iran. Is this problematic, or will it unify Sunni Shia divide? Also good question. Actually, the Houthis are not Shia. You need to bear this in mind. And Hezbollah are Shia. So it's Iran. But Hezbollah and Iran made a conscious decision that they're not going to support Hamas in this war. And this was made very clear by the head of Iran. He said Hamas did not ask us permission. So did Hezbollah. Hezbollah are just keeping the status quo between them and Israel in the south. They're not really involving themselves anymore. And although there are casualties on both sides, but they're very minimal. Hezbollah made this clear, Hamas from the beginning, and this was mentioned by the Lebanese president, and also you heard this directly from the Iranian president. However, Israel wants to pull them in, and Israel's attack on Iran's consulate is very interesting. How they would like this to go beyond the current borders that it is at the moment. However, the Houthis, and having visited Yemen many times, the Houthis are not Shia, they are Zaydis. And the people of Yemen are either Shafi'i or Zaydi. And the Zaydi are between Sunnah and Shia, and they are closer to the Sunnah than the Shia. And they accept Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman's Khilafah, and they do not have the same idea. Having visited Yemen, 99%, actually 100% of the Yemen population is for Palestine. So what is happening? The attacks are not just representing the Houthis, they are representing the Yemeni people in a sense. So this is a different idea that we need to take forward. And I don't think the Shia will play a great role in the liberation of Bayt al-Maqdis. Adiba, what is the final outcome that they want to achieve from this war together, and what they intend to actually stop? I'm not sure if you mean this war in Gaza or if you're talking about the greater war that they're aiming to. If you please explain this, I'll be grateful. Shahraya, I am Jazakallah khair. My sincere apologies for saying your name by mistake many times. Shahraya, Barakallah fiki for your very good questions. Okay, thank you, Adiba, for explaining. The final outcome they would want to achieve out of this war was mentioned by Netanyahu a few times. He wants to end Hamas completely. This is a goal, even by the American advisors, is unachievable. It is not possible to end Hamas. And they do this. However, the untold story is this. This has been a plan of Israel from a very long time ago, from the 1970s. And Israel took the chance to fulfill this time. The idea was to empty Gaza and to force the people into Sinai. And then actually they agreed with even some Muslim countries to take some of the refugees. And they said this was done already in Syria and other places. So let's get rid of the people out of Gaza. The resilience of the people in Gaza, particularly the north, and the staying of close to 400,000, even when Israel is bombing them day and night, and not leaving their land has ruined the plan of Israel. So from the 1970s, Israel has been pushing this idea forward. It was suggested to Hosni Mubarak. He said, this is political suicide, I will not do it. Sisi actually accepted. And in return, all the debt of Egypt would be paid off. And then he started creating zones in which the Palestinians will be in a bigger prison enclosed within that area. And this was being pushed forward. However, the Gazans have managed to derail this. Every day, Israel comes with a new plan. So one plan was to use the tribal leaders against Hamas and create a new. All of them went and supported the resistance. So they used Mahmoud Abbas and his men, Majid Faraj, to bring in a group of under the Red Crescent, Egyptian Red Cross or Crescent, into Gaza in order to try to topple the resistance. And Hamas managed to arrest and kill some of them. And Hamas, now Israel is pushing this idea. They want to get rid of the political part of Hamas in Gaza. And they're trying this in every possible way, and they have failed so far. But this is what they aim to do, and they keep pushing this in that direction. Who is funding this war? The West is funding it, unfortunately, and both European countries and America is funding this. However, now this is going to bite them in their back, with this being backfired against them within their own states, particularly after the case of South Africa. And now this is illegal to support Israel in its war. This will stop many of these states supporting this. They have a lot of tech companies and news channels pushing their narrative. How do Muslims fight this tech-scum psychological warfare forever? Actually, this is, Adiba, a very good question and a very sad question that we do not have even our platforms. We're having this web seminar on Zoom. We have our narrative on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. All these are not our platforms. But okay, even if we do not have our own platform, let's use these platforms. And the Quran says clearly, your first step to ending this is exposing their faces, blackening their faces. And you need to be doing this effectively. And this, we need to be doing this in their own channels. And this actually, at the moment, the last time I was in Germany, I heard this from Jewish Voices for Peace, and the speaker, what he said was very interesting. Shahriya and those in Germany, what he said is 60% of the German people are against what Israel is doing, but they are not able to speak. They are silent because of this guilt of the Holocaust and because of other things involved in this in this matter. So you are winning this narrative war, although their machine is working 24/7. You need to keep pushing this at an individual level, at collective level, and we need to be able to do this collectively, not just individually, through certain campaigns, and push this forward together, inshallah. So I've gone through all the questions in the question Q&A section. I will now go through. My apologies, we've gone over 15 minutes over time. If we look at our current situation based on historical analysis, when can Bayt al-Maqdis and Yuruhi, when can Bayt al-Maqdis be liberated? And what do you think about the saying Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who predicted 2027? Jazakallah khair. Wallahi, I'm so glad with the discussion, the level of discussion, and I extend my thanks again to Balagh Academy. The discussion is very deep. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin based his opinion on the Quranic Sunnah, the Quranic Sunnatullah, and he says that generations. It took Musa alayhi salam, who his generation had failed him. It took another 40 years before this generation changed to another generation. So this is important. This is where he's starting. The starting point is that the generation changes over 40 years. So it took Bani Israel to enter the land of Beit al-Maqdis 40 years before a new generation was created. So this is number one. He counts this from 1947-48. 40 years is 1987, which is the first Intifada. And this was the new generation that was based on the Quran that fought Israel with the stones, with everything that they had, their hands. And he says a new generation by 2027, 2028 will take place that will be able to end this. However, this is only true if you yourselves fulfill the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the rest of the Sunnah. The Sunnah of Allah does not change for anyone. If you work hard, you ask me, would it happen in 2027? If everyone here, the 28 people here, work 24/7 tirelessly towards the liberation of Masjid Al Aqsa, Al Aqsa will be liberated, inshallah, by 2027. Maybe 2028, maybe 2026. If you fulfill the Sunnah of Allah, if you work, how much you work, the closer we are to achieving that goal. Okay, the last question was from Adiba, and already we have answered it. I thank you very much for this deep discussion and for your questions, and my apologies that we've gone over the time in answering the questions. But barakallah feekum, jazakumullah khair, jazakumullah khair to every single one of you who have attended and have listened attentively. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, like He has gathered us in this discussion, that what you have taken from this discussion, you turn it into a knowledge that drives change in yourself, in your community, and also in your surrounding. And inshallah, together we march towards the liberation of the Masjid Al Aqsa and ending this racist Zionist ideology in the land of Beit al-Maqdis and ending the injustice that it has created. Inshallah, we meet in the liberated Masjid Al Aqsa soon, inshallah. Barakallah feekum. Jazakumullah khair al-jaza. Wa barakallah feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.